everybody. Thank you so much for being here with me this afternoon. Thank you, Jorge. Thank you, Yasmin, for that beautiful introduction. And thank you to El Paso Community College and all the students that are here with me today. Also, thank you to whoever is giving away these free books, because free is pretty awesome. So get one if you haven't gotten one. All right, so I am the author of 2 books. The first one is a collection of short stories. Some of you may have read some of these stories in your classes. And I also wrote a novel, and this is based off my family history in Denver, Colorado. So when I was growing up, I loved reading books, but I never saw any characters that accurately resembled my family or my community in Denver. And it was sort of like we didn't exist at all. And I wanted to make sure nobody felt like that anymore. And I decided I would have to write my own books because they weren't being written without me. And so that's how I ended up writing both Sabrina and Corina. I'm going to start by reading a little bit from the first book, and then I'll read some from Woman of Light, and I'll open it up for questions with all of you. So I won't call on you and freak you out and make you ask a question on the spot, but if you think of any questions while I'm reading, go ahead and keep those. And then you do have to come up here on the spot and come to the mic, which I think can always be a little intimidating. Or you can just shout. I think I could hear you. Okay, so I'm going to start with the story called Sugar Babies. It's the very first story, and it starts on page 3. Sugar Babies. Though the southern Colorado soil was normally hard and cakey, it had snowed and then rained an unusual amount that spring. Some of the boys in my 8th grade class decided it was the perfect ground for playing Army. They borrowed shovels and picks from their father's sheds, placing the tools on their bicycle handlebars and riding it to the western edge of our town, Cewarita, a place where the land with its silken fibers of swaying grass resembled a sleeping woman with her face pressed firmly to the pillow. A golden blonde by day, a raven-haired beauty by night. The first boy to hit bone was Robbie Martinez. He did so with the blunt edge of a rusted shovel, and out of the recently drenched earth, he lifted a piece of the brittle, faded whiteness and tossed it downwind like it was nothing more than a scrap of paper. "Look," he said, kneeling as if he was praying. "Everybody come look." The other boys gathered around. There in the ground lay broken pieces of bowls with black zigzagging designs. Next to those broken bowls were human teeth, scattered like dried kernels of yellow corn. Above them, the sun had begun to fade behind the tallest peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The sky was pale and bleak, like the bloated belly of a lizard passing them above. "Don't touch it," Robbie said. "None of it. We need to tell somebody." And tell they did. The entire town. Everyone, it seemed, was a witness. Days after their discovery, our final 8th grade project was announced. We gathered in the gym for an assembly. The teachers brought together the boys from technical education class and the girls from home economics. We sat in 10 rows beneath dangling ropes and resting basketball hoops. The room, it smelled like a tennis ball dipped in old socks, and the cement walls were padded in purple vinyl, supposedly to minimize dodgeball injuries, but I thought it looked like a loony bin. Mrs. Sharpley, a bug-eyed woman with a neck like a giraffe's but a torso like a rhino's, she stood before us on a wooden box. "For the remaining 2 weeks of your junior high career," she had said, "you will care for another human life." She then reached behind her into a paper grocery bag, revealing a sack of C&H pure cane sugar. "Sugar babies," she said. "We will be raising our very own sugar babies." Older kids had gossiped about notorious school projects. We had heard stories of piglet dissections, the infamous growing and changing unit, rocket launches with carbon dioxide canisters, and there was a cow's lung blackened and doused in cigarette smoke. But no one had warned us about sugar babies. Now, sugar babies are a lot of responsibility, Mrs. Sharpley said as she stepped down from her box and paced with the sugar sack. She explained we were to be graded on skills like feeding, bonding, budgeting, and more. She then passed around diaper directions. We do it all alone. It was Selana Segura. She was behind me, her perpetual whimper causing every sentence to end like a little howl. Like we're single moms and stuff. Somewhere down the rows, a boy chirped, but the DNA shows I am not the father. We all laughed until Mrs. Sharpley held up 2 fingers, signaling silence. Of course not, she said. You will be in committed partnerships. We're drawing names. A teacher's aide in Payless Flats scurried like a magician's assistant toward Mrs. Sharpley. She carried 2 Folgers cans decorated in pink and blue glitter. Mrs. Sharpley set down her sugar, taking the cans from the aide and giving each a good shake. From the pink can, the first name she pulled was Mimi Yazzie, who stood and slinked forward, burying her face into her arms as Miss Sharpley called out her partner, Mike Ramos. This cycle of humiliation lasted for several more rounds before I was partnered with Roberto Martinez, the Bone Boy. After school, Robbie and I sat outside on the swings. He was a scrawny kid with frequently chapped lips and a light dusting of freckles across his low nose. He played soccer, and he always wore a beat-up blue windbreaker and knockoff Adidas sneakers, the kind with 4 stripes instead of 3. The sugar baby was planted in his lap, balanced ever so gently between his 2 stick arms. His dark eyes were so big and so wide they resembled 2 brown pigeon eggs, and he spoke with a quavering, squeaky voice. They said we have to name it. Do you want to pick it out, Sierra? No. I swung up on the swing. You name it, and you take it home tonight. I swung down. I'll watch it tomorrow, but only if I have to. That's cool, he said. What about Miranda? That's my grandma's name. Whatever, I sighed, leaning back on the swing. Name it after your grandmother. Name it after your entire family. I don't care. I pumped until the rusted chain pulled taut. Then I jumped, landing in the mushy gravel with both feet, and I took off for home. Ain't that something, my father said, as he and I ate breakfast the next morning. On our small black and white TV above the microwave, aerial shots of the dig site were being shown on the news. The land appeared as an enormous shadow box with scraps of ancient people instead of thimbles and porcelain knickknacks. Can we go see it? I asked my father, spooning my last bits of cornflakes into my mouth. I suspect they don't want us to do that, he said, keeping his eyes to the TV. There were deep lines around his eyelids. His hair was purely silver, and his hands were spotted from years as working as a roofer beneath the Colorado sun. People had begun to mistake him for my grandfather. Why not? We should be allowed to. I walked to the sink and I tossed my dirty dish inside. It's where we're from. It's our people. My father scratched his chin. There was a thin turquoise ring on his finger where there had once been a gold wedding band. Don't leave a dish in the sink, he said. How many times I gotta tell you that, Sierra? I turned back and I soaped up my bowl. I mean it, I told him. I want to go to the dig site. Things like this have always happened around here, Sierra. It's nothing special. I told him that it was special to me as I scrubbed my dish with a green and yellow sponge, the milky water gargling loudly down the drain's black rubbered lips. As I rinsed the bowl once more, I peered through the window above the sink. The morning was clear, and in the distance, the mountains were crystal blue like an enormous wave. As if sailing across those waters, a small white pickup truck with a front end bra pulled down our street and rumbled over the gravel in our driveway. Long, dark hair clouded the truck's windshield, and very red, very long fingernails were coiled around the steering wheel. A silver rosary dangled above the dash. "Papa," I called over my shoulder, drying my hands on my jeans. My father rose and stood tall behind me, smelling of leather and dirt. "Looks like she's back again," he said. He grunted some, swishing spit around inside his mouth before shooting a stream of yolky bile into the sink. "Go outside, Sierra. Say hello to your mother." My mother first left 3 years ago. It happened one morning after she cooked breakfast. I watched as she gathered her keys and coat and walked into our wintry yard without any shoes. She left footprints as slight as bird tracks in the snow. When I asked my father later why she had left us, he simply said, "Sometimes a person's unhappiness can make them forget they are part of something bigger, something like a family, a people, even a tribe." My mother occasionally would come home for a day or two to gather forgotten necklaces or purses, though over time, my father moved her things from the bedroom to a box in the crawl space. Her visits were infrequent enough that I learned to live without her. It wasn't easy at first. Sometimes I'd hear a funny story at school or church, and my first thought would be, "You have to tell Mama." But over time, that urge to be with her, to tell her things, to be a part of her, it went away, just like my mother always did. Now stop reading from Sabrina and Corina there. So I get asked a lot where the inspiration for my stories comes from. And my dad jokes that he had no idea that when they made me take care of a bag of sugar in middle school, like it was a real baby, that one day I would grow up and I would write a short story about it. And we had to put like a diaper on the little bag of sugar and pretend to feed it. I don't know if anyone else did an assignment like that. It seems to be something they're not doing as much anymore. But I remember I was just like a really bad sugar baby mom. And that's where that story came from. And I want to share that because all of you are living through stories right now. And all of you can turn those into art. It doesn't matter if one day they're put into a book, but you can pass them down to your family and you can tell those stories. But yeah, one day I had to bring home a little bag of sugar and raise it just like it was a real baby. So that brings me to my next book that I'm going to read from, and this is Woman of Light. So this book is my first novel. Sabrina and Corina is 11 short stories, but for this one, I wanted to tell a bigger story. And this is the story of my family's migration from southern Colorado and northern New Mexico to Denver in the 1920s. And the reason I wanted to tell this story is because even growing up in Colorado and taking history classes and being a part of the community in a really big way, our history was not part of the official record. We were taught that Colorado was settled by Anglos who had come out west seeking their fortune in the gold and silver mining industries, and nobody talked about us. Nobody talked about people like my great-grandma. She was a migrant farm worker. She picked sugar beets. Nobody talked about people like my Auntie Lucy, who had the sight, and she would have these psychic visions, and she was able to warn people in the family because she would have bad dreams that bad fortune was coming for them. And I wanted to make sure people like my ancestors, they got to have their say in history too. So I spent 10 years researching this novel, Woman of Light, and I'm really proud to say that it's out in the world now. And I hope that my ancestors are happy with it, but I think they are because right before it came out, I did have a dream that my Auntie Lucy, who Luce is based on, she came and talked to me, and I was so dorky that I asked her for a selfie from the spirit world. And she said, okay, she's this old woman, but in my dream, she was a little bit younger. So I'm going to read from the very beginning of the book, and then I'm going to go to a different time period. But the very beginning of the book is set in 1868, and it's in what I call the Lost Territory. And those are all the territories south of Denver, and in this region too, that the US essentially stole from Mexico. The Sleepy Prophet and the Child from Nowhere. And if you're following along, this is just the very first page. The night Fortudes Marisol Ortiz rode on horseback to the northern Pueblo Pardona, a secluded and modest village. The sky was so filled with stars, it seemed they hummed. Thinking this good luck, Virtudes did not cry as she left her newborn on the banks of an arroyo. Turkey down wrapped around his body, a bear claw fastened to his chest. "Remember your line," she whispered before she mounted her horse and galloped away. In Pardona, land of early sky, the elder Desideria Lopez dreamt of stories in her sleep. The fireplace glowed in her clay home as she whistled snores through dirt walls, her breath dissipating into frozen night. She would have slept soundly until daybreak, but the old woman was pulled awake by the sounds of plodding hooves and the chirping of crickets, the crackling of burnt cedar, an interruption between dawn and day. "Enough is enough," Desideria muttered and cursed as she slow rolled from bed onto her bald feet. The noises were maddening as she stood. Her back was permanently bent in a slight L, and she wore long, woven skirts that brushed the floor, matted in sheepskin. She wrapped herself in a white shawl and slid her hands into fox fur mittens, fingerless to easily handle her tobacco. Her pipe was formed of mica clay, and the sparkling burn illuminated Desideria's grooved face as she hobbled toward the door, soon fastening a red handkerchief beneath her broad chin. The warmth of her breath tried to linger inside the home, but Desideria hacked into a phlegmy cough and wrangled the air back into her lungs. "You're coming with me," she had spoke, and walked outside. Known as the Sleepy Prophet, she was an important woman in Pardona. During ceremony, she went into trance, recollecting 1,000 years worth of visions and dreams, but her output was unsteady. Many years later, when radios had come into fashion and everyone had a massive box near their altars, the few who still remembered Pardona recalled Desideria Lopez and how her spirit antenna was often broken. But sometimes, many times, it worked just fine. Now, Desideria stood at the arroyo's uneven banks, smoking her pipe and considering the sloping way blue darkness layered the nearby mountains. The arroyo gurgled beneath slender ice. The Spanish had named the stream Lucero because starlight shimmered over the waters trickling back, as if the earth had been saddled with sky. The galloping sounds in her dreams had vanished, and the sacred mountains looked upon Desideria with what felt like amusement in their grouped trees and rock veins. She squinted and turned her pipe over, removing the mouthpiece with her right hand. She stepped over hardened snow toward a rattling among dormant thistle and chokecherry trees, snagging her left thumb until Desideria bled darkly about her fingerless mittens. "Who's making that racket?" she called out in Tiwa. When there was no answer, Desideria tried her various dialects. And finally, after waiting several heartbeats, she turned away from the water and brush and said in Spanish, "Freeze then, baby." Pidre cried, loud as a drum. And Desideria pulled at the thistle and chokecherry branches, their stems flickering like the souls of the newly dead. She gasped at the sight of all the trouble. There, an infant with wet gray eyes, a baby who reached toward the sleepy prophet, his face striped in shrubbery shadows. Desideria grunted as she lifted the baby from the weeds. He was cold, and there was a bear claw around his neck, dusted in snow. "We'll get you warmed up," she said with a calm urgency, carrying the baby to the water's edge, his face cradled to her low breasts. She dipped her left hand into the thinly frozen creek and rinsed the dried blood from her fingertips before smearing a droplet onto the baby's cheek. He did not cry at the coolness. Instead, he locked eyes with the sleepy prophet, his brow furrowed, serious in his demeanor. Desideria chuckled at his little angry baby face. "It will be only a moment," she explained. "I am looking for a message." And over the baby's face, the water reflected the sky, those reddish and winged planets. "You were left," Desideria said after some time. "Left to be found. The baby surprised her then, gathering his lips and attempting to suckle her spacious chest, but the sleepy prophet only laughed. It's been dry for some time, little one. Dawn now. Orange and lavender lines appeared beyond the eastern mountains. The world warmed as Desideria carried the baby through the desert, her fur slippers cracking through ice snow. She hummed prayers to the baby as she walked, songs about heat, greetings of light, the blessings of the sun and moon. She brought the baby to the center of Pardona, past the adobe homes with their blue doorways to deflect drifting spirits. In the distance, a cemetery of wooden crosses was scattered about the hillside as if the Spanish had once spilled a bucket of Catholicism over the land. At the old mission church in the plaza, a white cross leaned left, and the air sounded with the squawking of sparrows and wrens. Desideria left the pink-hued morning and entered the church, blessing herself and the baby with holy water at the door. As was tradition, beneath the floorboards, 4 dead priests were buried, and their spirit voices greeted Desideria as she stepped over the ground above their coffins. They told her in Spanish that they knew of a secret, and the sleepy prophet groaned with annoyance before she asked them to go on, spill it. Tell me, she said. Can't, they said. And Desideria stomped the floorboards. She rattled the walls. Ouch, they said. Out with it, she said, and stomped once more. Fine, said one of the priests. The baby has a name. Would you like to know? When the dead priest finally relented, Desideria repeated the name, her voice echoing throughout the dirt-walled sanctuary. She looked at the baby who had scratched a faint purple line into his cheek with his translucent fingernail. Desideria noted to cut them later. Pidre, she said, and smiled at the baby. Like stone. Deeper inside the chapel, several young women were on their hands and knees, sweeping the floor with horsetail brushes. Dried rose petals were piled around them, and at the altar was a clay statue of La Virgen de Guadalupe, dressed in red silk. The young women were preparing for her feast day, and the church smelled of incense and blue sage, and the copal traded and carried 1,400 miles south in Mexico City. They gazed at the sleepy prophet as she stepped before them with the baby in her arms. Who is that? Asked one of the women. Pidre, she said, thumbing the baby's bare claw. From where? Seems he's mixed blood, said Desideria. Maybe Spanish, probably not French. I'd say from his blanket he comes from the southern villages. Who abandons their own? Another young woman asked with disdain. Desideria thought of why babies are sometimes left. She saw images in her mind she'd rather not see. She felt profound hunger, witnessed a village perched high on a hill, horses slaughtered for food, a church crumbling back into the earth from which it was built. The sleepy prophet studied Pidre then. He gazed upon her with recognition. His spirit felt complimentary. He was like an old friend. He was a grandson she had fished from the weeds. We cannot know the depths of another sacrifice, said Desideria, easing the baby into the young woman's arms. For now, find him a breast, one that works. As a child, Pidre was a great hunter with a stern expression over his cloudy eyes. Often haughty, he was disciplined by the men of Pardona with a grass lash. He giggled his way through beatings, a spirit, the people said, that could not be tempered. When the other boys threw stones at his back or smacked his ankles with broken cornstalks and called him names like Snow Blood or Sky Eyes, he did not meet them with violence. And over time, they relented, for Pidre had the gift of storytelling, a strong ability to tell jokes. Once, as the women prepared meals for All Souls' Day, Pidre, a runt of a boy with spidery arms and twig legs hid beneath fat loaves of orno bread. He lay on the table covered in dozens of steaming loaves, inhaling the yeasty scent until the other boys entered the kitchen from their afternoon snack. At that moment, he raised his arms as if climbing from a shallow grave. The women screamed and beat the bread flat with their brooms and handkerchiefs. Later, when Desideria heard about what Pidre had done, She told him it would have been much funnier if he had been naked, like a real demon, she had said. Within 11 years, Desideria Lopez lay dying of old age on the sheepskin rugs in her clay home. The earthen smell of her bedroom had been replaced with the stale stench of sickness, a body soon to erode. On her altar, she had placed dried apricots and biscuits for the journey, and the air sounded with music, a distant lullaby prayer. Pidre rested his face in the nook between her neck and shoulder, her silver hair plaited around her distinguished face. He kissed her section braids. He listened to her shallow breaths, the sounds of her spirit slipping away from him. "You're only little now," said the sleepy prophet, "but I saw you as a man." Between tears, Pidre asked, "What am I like, Grandma? Who do you see?" "You live near a large village on the other side of the lost territory, along a river, surrounded by their mines." "Mines?" Pidre asked. "They're gutting," she said. "You will have a fierce wife and many daughters, but do not be vengeful people." "Grandma," he said, "I don't understand." "Oh, my baby, you will." "I miss you," Pidre cried. "I already feel it. I am missing you now. But I am still here." Desideria closed her eyes and winced at a pain that seemed lodged within her heart. "Pidre," she had said. "Yes." "You gave me such joy." She wheezed into the ghost of a laugh. "You are my grandson and you are my friend. Thank you for coming into my life." She let out her final exhale, her breath circling the room. At that, Desideria Lopez, the sleepy prophet of Pardona Pueblo, moved from the temperature of the living into the temperature of the dead. As Pidre grew up, he was well liked and respected among his people. Mexicano, French Canadian, and American traders often traveled through Pardona, bringing their weapons and furs, metal trinkets, and fancy candies. Pidre had an eye for these things and an ear for languages. He bartered with the traders and stored their impressive items beneath his sheepskin. In exchange for small tasks, Pidre would dole out candies to the children of Pardona. One day, he predicted that he would leave, and he came and told the elders, "I know where I come from, but I'd like to see the other side too." The sleepy prophet predicted it. After much deliberation, the elders agreed that it was time, and they sent the boy off with many beautiful pots and furs and handcrafts to trade for the white man's money in town. There were several nights of dancing. The clowns came out with their black and white paint. The women gave offerings of winter and summer food, and the men presented their advice. "Be wary of their currency, for it is marked with blood." And I'll stop there. Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. So Woman of Light is set in two time periods. The time period I just read from in the 1860s to the 1900s, early 1900s. And then it follows a character named Luce in the 1930s who has visions of her ancestors. And the book is told deliberately in these two different time periods because I wanted to mimic the way that memory works, especially as it's passed down between generations. So sometimes we can remember stories that are not just our own stories, but stories that came from an older generation, from our elders, and from people who have passed on. So that book, it's different than Sabrina and Corina, but Luce also has some of the same issues that she's dealing with as the characters in Sabrina and Corina. And I think that's sort of the nature of generations and the nature of everything that we are getting from our families in the past. I want to open it up now for some questions. And then when we're done with that, I'd love to sign your books and I'll come sit over there at the table. So does anyone have any questions for me?
Hi, thank you for your reading. I'm Alejandro, I'm an instructor here, art instructor. But on the topic of Native American creativity and representation, do you feel like with the prevalence of like technology and Native American imagery and stories, is something being gained or lost in this new platform in which Native American stories are being told and retold? Thank you.
This is a great question for me because my new novel is set in 2045. And so I'm actually really starting to think about where we're headed as a community and how technology is changing our storytelling and changing the way that not only do we engage with each other, but the oral tradition. So when I was growing up, I couldn't hear stories from other communities. I only heard stories from my people in their living rooms and their stories. But now you can go on TikTok, you can go on Instagram and social media, and you can gather stories from all over the world, essentially. But one of the things that I do think that we are going to see more of, and if we want to survive as a species, as a human species, is that we need to go back to indigenous knowledge in terms of how do we take care of the planet. So I've been doing a lot of research in water management and water infrastructure, especially here in Texas with the aquifers. Where I come from in Colorado, we have rivers, and that's where we're getting the water from, but they're also starting to have to dig really deep down. But indigenous communities, we've always known for as long as we have existed, for time immemorial, that we need to be by a water source, and we need to be responsible with the water source. So this is something that I'm really starting to think about. And I've been actually, like, a couple weekends ago, I went undercover to a tech conference and I dressed like a techie. And I talked to all these different, these companies with sulfur batteries, and they had their self-driving air taxis and that kind of thing. And a lot of them were telling me that we're coming into a big problem unless we look back at indigenous knowledge all across the world. So I definitely think it's something that is going to become more and more important. And I don't believe that we need to leave the planet and go colonize other planets. Like, that is not, I'm an indigenous person from this planet, and you will never get me or my ancestors to leave. This is where we come from. So that's a great question for me as on my new project. So thank you. Thank you for that. Other questions? Thank you guys for coming. I just really appreciate you spending your afternoon with me.
Good afternoon. My name is Sean Duran, and I had a question for you. What was the most surprising thing you learned while writing the books?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So, well, it was different for each book. So with Sabrina and Corina, some of the more surprising things I learned is that I had the ability to finish a book. And sometimes when I tell that to people, depending on the audience, they'll laugh at me. And I say, no, like, I was a very bad student. I struggled with depression and anxiety. I have a GED. I dropped out of my first graduate program. It never occurred to me that I would have enough willpower and enough self-discipline to finish an entire book and then publish it. So Sabrina and Corina taught me something about my character that I never knew existed. My whole life growing up, I was the brat. I was lazy. I was a bad kid. And then suddenly now I'm like a pretty well-known writer. So it's really changed the way that my family addresses me. They look at me with a different light in their eyes now. And with Woman of Light, one of the things that surprised me is how I thought that my family was really unique. I thought that people who were descended from Pueblo people from northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. I thought that the people that were mixed like my family with Filipino and Jewish who had also been working in the fields alongside each other, I thought that no one on earth was like us, that we were the only people ever. And then my book comes out and people from all over the country are coming to my book signings and they're saying, guess what? My great grandpa also came from the Philippines. Or guess what? I also have a Jewish grandmother. Or guess what? I feel so mixed. I feel like there's nowhere for me to go. Where is my identity? Where's a place for me? And so Woman of Light has really given me the gift of understanding that I'm part of a really big community. And that's just a huge, huge historical gift because I just felt so alone through much of my life. So thank you. That's a really wonderful question. Thank you. Other question? Yes. Hi. Yeah, so it was a long journey. So I'm a overnight 10-year success. And I really like to say that because a lot of people, especially when Sabrina and Corina came out, I looked so young. They figured that I had just written that book a day before and got it published. But I had written those stories over a span of 10 years, and I graduated with my master's in 2013, and that book was pretty much done. No publisher would look at that book for 10 years almost. It took 7.5 years to get a book deal. And at that time, there weren't very many voices like mine being published. And so I didn't get a lot of financial support from the publisher. But once that book started getting nominated for prizes like the National Book Award, it won an American Book Award, then suddenly the publisher was like, we might be able to make money off of her. And they pushed a little bit harder for Woman of Light. But it hasn't been something that came to me very easy. And that's also why I'm very passionate to be places like here, so I can talk to all of you, because some of you might be writers or artists that also want to get your voice out there. And I just have to share with you that if it doesn't happen tomorrow or next week or next month, it can happen. One of the reasons that writers don't succeed is because they give up too soon. And always just keep going and keep pushing. You might be an old lady or an old man, but by the time it comes out, but you'll still have that product and it'll last forever. Thank you for that question. Other questions? Yeah. Writer's block. Okay, how do I deal with writer's block? I do a lot of research, and the research invigorates me. So I told you I went undercover to the tech conference. It's kind of fun to pretend like I'm a new character and walk around and talk to people. and then you come home when you have all this adrenaline. You're like, oh, I think I'm going to write a story now. So one of the ways I deal with getting out of writer's block is getting out of my own head and my own identity, and going and engaging with people and talking to them and learning about what they're making. I also am really inspired by other artists. So I feel really proud that I've cultivated friendships with actors, dancers, musicians, and their art inspires me to push harder with my own art. But writer's block, I think it's a very solvable problem. We just have to look at it differently and realize that we can find inspiration literally in the world around us. Thank you for your question. Other questions? Yes.
So your stories are personal, right?
Yeah.
Did your family push back on your storytelling?
Well, the thing is, I think that my family had felt so silenced for generations. There was so much shame around certain taboo subjects that in the very beginning, there was a little bit of it before I had even published any of the stories individually. I remember my father had found a copy of my story, Any Further West, which deals with a complicated mother-daughter relationship. And he was holding up the draft of the story, and he told me, you can never show your mother. And I felt, pretty ashamed, like I had done something bad by writing about my true feelings. But then that story got published in the Boston Review, and you'll never believe what my mom did. She bought like 50 copies to give to all her friends. And then she said to me, how did you know what it was like for me to grow up with my mom? And so that's when I started to realize that what I was writing about and what I was experiencing was generational. I wasn't the only person in my family line that had ever had those feelings and had ever felt that shame. My mom also felt that shame. She doesn't recognize herself in any of the stories, and that's okay, because she actually finds healing in them in her own way. And I also think that the books have healed my relationship with my mother. She helped me incredibly with Woman of Light because she was the holder of the family history. And so that we have created a new bond over that. I'll never have the movie fairy tale mom that everybody wants, but I do have a mom that helps me and loves me in the way that she can. And writing the books have made me more comfortable accepting her for who she is. So thank you for that question. More questions, or should we get to signing? What, we have another question? Where is it? Where's the hand? Okay, hi. That's such a beautiful question. Thank you. So when I was first writing Sabrina and Corina and I was a student, I remember writing out a message that I wanted my books to teach. And I remember thinking, all I want these books to do is to make someone else feel less lonely. That's all I hope, is that when you read Sabrina and Corina or Woman of Light, you don't feel so lonely in your own history and your own life, because these characters have gone through those things too. So the biggest thing for me is that you feel that you have somebody there for you in these characters, and you love them even if they're complicated, because that's how our families are. They're complicated, but we still love them. Thank you for your question. Do we have time for one more? Okay, yes.
You told me about craft, so you write very beautifully, and it just seems very natural, and it's so giving. So my question is it very natural? Like, does it just come flowing out of you, or do you go back in and say, how can I pump this up a little bit?
That's that's great. Thank you. I would like to be able to tell you that I just sit down, I got this amazing first draft, and I pump it out, and then it gets published. But no, I do painstaking revision. I go back for the sound. I make sure every single word is the way I want it. And that's why my books so far have taken a long time. But hopefully I'm getting a little faster. And I also have more resources now. And when I was writing these books, I worked several jobs. It wasn't like I could just go home and write all day. I actually had to go to work or take care of my family and do that kind of thing. But don't feel bad if you sit down and your first draft is not good. Like, right now, because I'm reading from my other books, all I can think about is how bad the book I'm writing right now feels. And that's because I haven't been able to go through and fix it. It's not even finished. I have to go through and then painstakingly make it the way I want it. So thank you all so much. I would love to sign your books for you, and it's just been a wonderful visit to El Paso Community College. Thank you, Jorge, for bringing me. Thank you.